Good morning. Glad to see everyone back and ready for a whole new topic at Business Math. We just completed all of Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, which dealt with payroll and percents. We're heading off a whole new direction. This course is actually made up of 5 different topics. The last topic was payroll. The next topic we're going to talk about is retailing. These topics don't necessarily build on one another. So they're kind of their own little bubble. Does that make sense? So you won't be doing any of the things that you did in the last section. We'll be covering a whole new set of vocabulary. We'll be covering a whole new set of topics. And again, we're going to be talking about retailing. When we finish Chapter 4, we'll head off a different direction, and it will be asset values. We'll be doing some evaluation of assets and depreciation and all. Another topic we're going to cover is simple interest, and the last topic we'll cover is compound interest and annuities. So each of these is a completely separate module, and I've got class notes for each of these modules. So you should have with you in your hand the new set of class notes, and we'll be following along doing those and heading in a whole new direction, not building on things we've done before. We'll continue to use the percents and the proportions, but on new topics. Does that make sense? Great. Lots of new vocabulary. The first topic in 4.1 is called Profitability in your book. And I'm going to put this on here, and we're going to discuss some of the new vocabulary. I've got one of these I need to pass out. Does everyone else have their class notes? Good. Obviously, if you're in business, you need to talk about whether or not you're making a profit. So that's the beginning of the topics we're talking about. Yes? Okay, just a second. One more set of notes. I'll let people pass these back to you. The first word that we're going to talk about is income or revenue, and I've got a typo there. I'm not a very good typist. It says that your income or your revenue, if you are in business, is the money that you receive for your goods or services. I think it really helps when we're in this topic if you consider yourself the owner of a retail business. I always like to think of myself as being the owner of a gift shop because I think that would be nice. I'd like to have pretty little baubles that I would take home and sit on the coffee table and things. You know, if you guys are fishermen, you can be sporting goods store owners, or if what you like to do, is collect some gorgeous object. It helps if in this topic you think of yourself as being a small business owner, buying merchandise, putting it on a shelf and selling it. Think of yourself as the owner of a small business where you're sort of in control. And obviously at that point, your income would be the money that you receive in your business by selling your goods or by selling your services. Okay? So like if you were a paper hanger or something, it would be the money that you receive for hanging the paper, whatever service it is. Cost or expenses, another set of vocabulary words that mean exactly the same thing. It is the money that is paid by your business for the goods or services that are provided by others. You're obviously going to be purchasing items to sell or purchasing, if you were in the service industry, I'll go back to the wallpaper. You're going to be purchasing, the glues and things to put the wallpaper up. So you're going to have some, expenses. Then profit. And this is a pretty important one, is the revenue that you take in minus all of your expenses. If you are in business, you obviously want to make a profit. Profit should be a positive number. If profit is not a positive number, it's because your expenses are higher than your revenue. Does that make sense? If profits are negative, would be bad, you wouldn't stay in business very long, and it means that you are not taking in enough income to cover all of the expenses. And those shouldn't be things that you haven't thought about before. A successful business should generate profits. When we're talking about costs, there are 2 types of costs that we're always going to be dealing with. One is the cost of goods, sometimes called the net cost, and that is the cost for actually buying the things you're going to sell in your business. So if I've got this wonderful gift shop, it's the price of all the goodies that I'm buying to put on the shelves. The other item that we have that has to do with cost is called the overhead or the operating expenses. They are the expenses incurred for being in business. You're going to pay rent, you're going to pay utilities, you're going to pay for an accountant, you're going to pay taxes, you're going to have a lot of expenses for being in business besides the price of the items that you're actually selling. So that's called your overhead. So you've got the cost of your goods, and then you actually have your what's called operating expenses or your overhead, and those are two different costs. Which brings us to another word that I don't know if you're familiar with or not, but you're going to be. It's called the break-even point. The break-even point is the amount that a business must earn in income, the revenue they must have in order to cover their total costs. It's the amount of money that you must make to cover all of the cost of your goods plus the cost of all of your overhead, all of the miscellaneous expenses that are part of being in business. We're going to then refer to net profit as the profit that is earned when all the costs are taken into consideration. The net profit is all the money above the break-even point. Does that make sense? There is a number line both in the book and on your sheet, and I really like it. I always think if I can draw a picture of it, it will make sense to me. Why we've got such a shadow there today. And we're going to be drawing these profitability number line diagrams through the rest of these class notes. You don't have to do them on your homework, but you need to have the feel for these so that you can come up with ideas of profit and where the break-even point is. First, starting at 0 and looking like a number line, yes, is the starting point. As we come across to the right, that's the cost of the goods. COG is our abbreviation for cost of goods. Then further along the number line, coming to the right, is the total of our operating expenses. Those two become the break-even point. Anything above the break-even point is net profit, and sales are down here on the far right-hand side. So let's look at a business that maybe you were in last year. It says you had a business that had net sales of $235,000. So write that number down under net sales, far right. The cost of the merchandise sold was $62,500. So right above cost of goods, I'd write $62,500, and I like to go ahead and put it here on the bottom because that's a pretty important number, $62,500. I'm giving you lots of information about this business. I'm also telling you that your overhead expenses were a total of $122,800 last year. So I want you to construct this profitability number line and find out if I made a profit or if I had a loss. First, we need to calculate the break-even point. The break-even point is the total of the cost of the goods plus the operating expenses. What's the break-even point for our business? $185,300. That's right. The break-even is cost of goods plus operating expenses. Now, I look over here on my number line and realize that my total sales were $235,000. My break-even point is $185,300. Since net sales were greater than break-even, I did indeed make some money. So I can subtract these two and come up with a net profit number. I take the net sales, which is $235,000, and I subtract the break-even. And if you think about it, what it's saying is if you covered all your expenses were a total of $185,000. Okay? You took in a total of $235,000. Anything above the break-even is money in your pocket. It's profit. Is that all right? Obviously, and we'll talk about that, had your net sales been below $185,300, right? I had net sales out here. Had these moved and come up underneath here, guess what? No profit. I would have had a loss. That's right. And that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be taking the sales numbers and moving them across the bottom of this line and deciding whether or not we had a profit or a loss. Is that all right? We can also use this number line diagram on individual items, and that's what we're going to be doing more of. Instead of working on the whole business for the whole year, we're going to be discussing individual sales of individual items. We're going to know what one item in our shop costs. We're going to know that our operating expenses are a percentage generally of the costs, and we're going to figure out whether or not we're making a profit or a loss on individual items. So, top of the next page says, that indeed you can find the profit or loss of a single item by using the selling price in place of net sales. If you read our story here, it says, and this is a guy story, we have a hardware store, and we're buying some tool for $4.50. So under cost of goods, we're going to put $4.50. Does that make sense? Okay. Then we're going to say, I want a $2 profit. So we're going to come over here under profit and put $2. I have a selling price of $7.99, and it wants me to complete the number line using those numbers. So we've got cost of goods at $4.50, profit at $2, selling price of $7.99. How can I come back to the break even? If I know that I'm selling it for $7.99 and I'm making $2 on it, do you see that it's a subtraction? And I'm coming back to say my break even then must be $5.99. And if I want to know how much operating expense I allowed for that particular tool then, I would subtract the break even from the cost of goods and end up with $1.49. So we're not always going to give you these in order from left to right and just have you be adding them. As you're moving to the right, you're adding things. As you're finding numbers back to the left, you'll be doing some subtracting. And so you need to get a feel for this number line, and then you'll know whether or not you're making a profit or making a loss. Are there questions about the number line itself? It's in the book also, and I think it's a very good tool in getting you to kind of have a correct feel for the profit or loss in a business. Okay. Now, there are two kinds of losses. And we're going to discuss this vocabulary. I don't know why this has got a shadow on it. There are operating losses and there are absolute losses. Okay? Operating loss is the first term we'll talk about. If I sell a product for less than the break-even point, but more than the price of the item, I've had an operating loss. For example, in this tool, if I sold an item for $5, I would have covered the price of the item. I paid $4.50 for it. I would have recovered that $4.50, but I would have an operating loss because I wouldn't have covered all of the operating expenses. So I wouldn't have helped pay for the utilities. I wouldn't have helped pay for the rent, but I would at least have covered the price that I paid for the tool itself before I put it on the shelf. So an operating loss is based on the break-even point. If you have an operating loss, it means you sold something for less than the break-even. Absolute loss is another story. That's based on cost only. If you have an absolute loss, it means you sold an item for less than you actually paid for it. An absolute loss would be that you sold it for less than the cost of the goods. In the case of my tool that I bought for $4.50, I would have an absolute loss if I sold it for, say, $4. That means I didn't even cover the price that I paid for it when I bought it. When I have an absolute loss, I also have an operating loss. because operating loss is the amount that it is below break even. So if I sold that, for example, for $4, my selling price would be here. I would have an absolute loss of 50 cents, but I would have a operating loss of $1.99. Anytime I have an absolute loss, I also have an operating loss. But if I have an operating loss, I don't necessarily have an absolute loss as long as I sold it in between the $4.50 and the $5.99. And you need to know and understand the difference between operating loss and absolute loss. You absolutely lost money. You sold the item for less than you actually paid for it. Operating loss says you didn't cover operating expenses. Okay, this next chart might be a little confusing. What I've done is put some categories across the top of this, and then I've inserted with my computer this profitability number line. So the numbers that I've put in here actually relate to the categories up high. Are you with me? For example, on number 3, I've got a cost of $48, and I've got a break-even point of $1.76. I've got a reduced selling price of $62, and that's where we need to begin. So cost of goods is how much? It was given to us as $48. Does everyone see that $48? So I'm going to put cost of goods 48 and my cost of goods 48 right here. I was also given the fact that I had a break-even point of $76. Those two items were given. The question is, can I fill out the rest of this chart? You should be able to take the break-even, subtract the cost of goods, and come up with what was allowed for operating expenses. The difference between the 76 and the 48 would be operating expenses. $28, great. Now obviously when I put this on the shelf, I put it on there for more than $76, but it didn't sell. So I marked it down. The reduced selling price that I marked it down to was $62. So someplace out here I had an original selling price, but I came and marked it down, which means I'm coming to the left, and I eventually sold it for $62. I'm going to put an arrow up to 62. Do you see it's between the cost of goods and break even? So I've had a loss. I would have had to have sold it for more than $76 to have had a profit. Okay. What kind of a loss have I had? I've had an operating loss. Have I had an absolute loss? No. I sold it below break even, but I did not sell it below the cost of the goods. So I've only had an operating loss. That operating loss is 76 minus the 62. I've got an operating loss of $14. Okay? I did not have an absolute loss because it was not below the cost of goods. So these numbers we're going to write, and then what we're going to do with our reduced prices as we move the price up and down, we're going to visualize. What I like to do is say I started out here making some profit and I marked it down, and this is where it stopped. When it stopped there, if it's below break even, I've had an operating loss. If I sell it below cost of goods, then I've had also an absolute loss. Okay, next problem. We have got, and again, this is where it's a little bit confusing. This goes up to this number here for cost. So cost is $129. Operating expenses of $36. The question I want to answer is, what is the break-even point? So we're going to put our cost of goods at $129. Put it right here. Operating expenses of $36. I add those two together. I'm moving to the right, so I've got $165 invested totally. That's my break-even point. Here's what I know. I know that I have an operating loss of $52. If I have an operating loss of $52, what does that tell me? I sold the item for $52 less than the break-even point. That's right. So $52 less than the break-even. So I need to think, what is the actual reduced price? The break-even point was $165. I sold it for $52 less than that. Do your calculations. What's the number? $113. So I need to reduce my item by moving to the left, and I need to think, where is 113? 113 is going to be down here below cost of goods. Just by looking at where my arrow is, I answered a couple of questions. Have I made a profit? No. Did I sell it below break even? Yes. So I've had an operating loss, which we knew was $52. I sold it for $113. I paid $129. I've had an absolute loss. I sold it for less than I actually paid for the item. I do the subtraction. That's $129 minus $113. And what's my absolute loss? I've got $16. So what you're going to be doing with your selling price is moving it as you reduce it to the left underneath your profitability number line and getting the feel for where it is compared to the cost of the item and the break-even point. Questions? It's hard to know whether you're adding or subtracting with these, and I think when you put that on that line, it helps you get the feel whether you're adding or subtracting. Are we ready to move to the next example? All right. We know different information this time. This time we know that we have, let me see, I'm going to scoot out a little bit. I don't know originally what my cost of goods are, but I know that I had operating expenses of $50, so I put that under $50. And I know that I have a break-even point of $275. So operating expenses are $50. Break-even is $275. Can I calculate the cost of goods? Take the break-even point, subtract the operating expenses, and you can back yourself into, by the subtraction, cost of goods, $225. Is this confusing, or is this making sense? Is that yes, it's confusing, or yes, it makes sense? Makes sense to me. Okay. Do you think that helps you visualize what's... Yeah, I think it's a great tool. And again, even if you don't make them for yourself, as long as you're thinking along the lines of moving left and right on there, that's what you need to be doing. All right, what else do we know? We know that we had an operating loss of $61. If I had an operating loss of $61, that tells me, operating loss says $61 below break even. So I need to take $275, which is the break even, subtract $61, come up with my number that I sold it for. My reduced price, when I reduced it, came down here to the left and was actually $214. When I look at where it is, I naturally know it's below cost of goods. So I also have an absolute loss. $225 minus $214 is $11. And the difference between the operating loss and the absolute loss is $50, which is actually your operating expenses. Anytime that you have both an absolute loss and an operating loss, the difference between those two numbers should be operating expenses. Are we ready to move on?
Would it still be possible to take your net profit from your operating expenses to find your...
We didn't have a net profit.
What I mean, whatever it is, whatever 61 is, $61.
Yes.
From 50.
Yes, you could have done that. He said, could I have just said, I know that that $61 represents how much I am below the break even. Could I just subtract the $50 in operating expenses to come up with the net loss? And the answer is yes. Because he sees that in a little bit different way, but it's a perfectly good solution. Yeah. Okay, top of the next page. We are now bicycle shop owners. We own Bike Haven. And here's what it says. We are buying a certain model bicycle for $85. That's our cost of goods. We are selling it for $165. So I've got 85 here under cost of goods. Cost of goods is 85. Selling price of 165. I want to make a $22 profit on my bike. Therefore, what did I set aside as operating expenses, and what would the break-even point be? If I know that the selling price of my bike is $165 and I've got a profit built in of $22, I can subtract to come up with the break-even point of $143. Take the difference between the break-even and the cost of goods. That'll give me what I've got set aside there for operating expenses. Making sense? Questions? Are we ready to move on? Okay. Generally, or many times, I guess, would probably be a better word for it. What we do with operating expenses in a business is we allow a certain percentage of the cost of the item for operating expenses. There are probably industry standards for different kinds of businesses that say generally operating expenses are a certain percentage of the cost, and we just mark items up based on a percentage versus a given set number like $22 or something. We'll make it a percentage of cost. This one says I'm buying things for $219, and no matter what I pay for items, we've decided in my business with the help of my accountant that I'm going to just mark operating expenses as 15% of the cost, and profit, I'll assume, will be 10% of the cost of any item that I buy. So I'm buying this item for $219. What I'm doing is allowing a 15% of cost amount for expenses, and I'm going to allow a 10% of cost amount for profit. So I'm going to know that the cost of goods is $219. My question is, what am I going to mark this up to sell? What's my original selling price going to be? The operating expenses are 15% of the cost. So we can either go directly with this calculation or do a proportion, but I see $32.85 in operating expenses. I therefore add those two together and come up with a break-even point of $251.85. I simply did 15% of the cost of the item. I've also decided that in order to decide what I'm putting something on sale for, I'm going to allow 10% for profit. So I'm going to do 10% of the cost of the item for profit, which is $21.90. I've decided to put a ticket on this for $273.75. Cost of the goods plus the operating expenses plus the profit will give me my original ticket price. So that's what the first question asks. What is the original selling price? Using that number line, you can answer many more questions. It says, if the original selling price is discounted 50%, what will the reduced selling price be? This is something that's a horrible color that no one liked. Whoops, I'm trying to go the other direction. I'm going to mark it down 50%. So I've taken the tag and I've put a big red X across it and say new price, reduced by 50%. Do your old change new or do whatever. Tell me, how much is my reduced price going to be? Thank you. 136.80. They're telling me 88. I used 87. I must not have rounded right. And I asked the question, look where it is on the number line. Take your original price, scoot it down, scoot it down, scoot it down, scoot it down, scoot it down. It's going to be right here. Are you with me? It's 136.88, they're telling me. Once you've found where that number is on your number line, have you made any money? No. Have you had an operating loss? Yes, I started to say absolutely, and I don't want to use that word, do I? I want to say certainly we have, because it's below break even. Question, have we had an absolute loss? Yes, we have, because looking at where $136 falls on the number line, it falls below cost of goods, we also have an absolute loss. That's how the homework's going to look. That's what the test is going to look like. You need to visualize these numbers. As you've got a reduced price, move it to the left underneath that number line. You'll be able to visualize whether you've had a profit or loss and what kind of loss if you've had one. So my numbers are going to be off by a penny since I didn't round right, I guess. How much was the operating loss? We established that the break-even was $251.85. Since that's the break-even point, I know that operating losses are below break-even. I'm going to subtract the selling price. I'm getting $114.98. You're going to be a penny different. Selling price is right here below cost of goods. How much is the absolute loss? The absolute loss is below cost of goods, so I'll take cost of goods, bring it down, subtract the $136.87, and I got $82.13. Everyone with the numbers? Is that okay in the back? Okay. We now own an appliance store. We've got something here that we're going to put on the floor for $239. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a microwave or something. So my original price when I put it on the floor is $239. My operating expenses are $57. Go stick those in. I absolutely know that the profit that I'm going to make on that is $75, so I'm going to put that under profit. And I need to sort of set this up before I can do anything else. I need to realize that if this is $239, which is my original selling price, I had a $75 profit built in. I can back into the break-even point by subtracting and saying that's $164. If my operating expenses are $57, I can subtract and come back to the cost of the goods, $107. From the $164, that'll give you the cost of the goods. So it's asking, what is the break-even point? The break-even is the selling price minus the net profit. Now, second part of this problem says, this thing doesn't sell. I'm going to put it on sale. I'm going to mark it 40% off. So, question is, what is the reduced selling price? Use old, change new. Tell me, what are we getting for the selling price of the stove? Who's got the number? Great. $143.40 is the reduced price. So I started out at my $239 and I reduced it and I moved the price down to $143.40. When you figure out where it is, I'm looking at my arrow, have I made a profit? No, I haven't made a profit. I'm below break even. I've had an operating loss. Have I had an absolute loss? No, because I've sold it above cost of goods. So it says, what is the operating loss, if any? 164 minus the selling price. I've had an operating loss of $20.60. Have I had an absolute loss? No. They don't have to be nice and neat and clean, but I would suggest that you do the little tick marks for cost of goods, break even, and then move your arrow to the left and right when you're reducing items. Sometimes we reduce items and we still make a profit. Obviously, these stores that are running big ads in the newspaper could not be selling all of this stuff on sale for 25% off and losing money on it. So when they're marking it down, they're still making a profit. A reduced price can still leave you in the profit area. We can be selling goods that are less than the break-even point. And obviously the last choice would be that we'd sell it with an absolute loss, which would be below the cost of goods. So anyway, we've got homework here on 4.1, 1 through 35 odd. The types of things that we've done today in class will be the kinds of things that are on that homework. I'm going to let them stop the tapes. We'll get started looking at the homework and see what kind of questions you have.